if we were to debate black people's existence, if we were to debate Jewish people's existence, there would be outrage, but it's perfectly acceptable to debate trans existence.
I'm here, there's a rally to show support for trans and non-binary students in Oxford University, students and academics, and as a transgender academic myself, I'm here to show my support.
In my view, Kathleen Stock has put herself forward as someone who's claiming to have been cancelled and silenced, but the very fact that she's recently published a book is evidence that she hasn't been silenced at all. And indeed, we're here not to try and silence and cancel, but to promote and celebrate trans joy and trans voices. So, in my view, more free speech, not less, but we need to diversify the voices that we're hearing. And I just think that at the moment there's just one or two very loud voices that are getting disproportionate amount of attention. And we need to hear from more people like those behind me about their lived experiences, people talking for themselves rather than talking about others.
Kathleen is a great supporter of women's sex-based rights, and she believes in free speech and that gender ideology shouldn't be taking over the world.
Have you read Kathleen's book, and what are your thoughts on her arguments? What didn't you agree with?
I haven't read the book, so I couldn't make comments on that. But the big thing that's been in the press at the moment is the discussion around freedom of speech, academic speech. And what I am pleased to report is that there's been an awful lot of debates and discussions, and despite reports that freedom of speech is dead in universities and that we can't have discussions, I'm here to say that I've seen those discussions firsthand, and I know that an awful lot of them are taking place. Of course, people will be invited to speak, and everyone has a right to an opinion, and everyone in certain circumstances is free to speak, and we should have different views at Oxford University. It's the only way we can challenge our own ideas, and it's the only way we can challenge and figure out who we are and what our discussions are. So debate and discussion is a good thing. I think the question really at the moment is that coming at the detriment of the welfare of the students? And that's a discussion that needs to be had within the university. It's clearly had media interest, it's clearly gone national, so it's clearly had an effect on students, many of whom will be sitting exams in the near future. And so I guess we do have to question whether, what the effect of speech in universities is on our student welfare.
So I haven't read the book. Honestly, my personal situation right now is such that I'm literally here just to support my brother. I don't have that much knowledge on it, but there comes a point where words are not really very meaningful anymore. And like my personal situation, I come from a family, very narcissistic, abusive, whatever, and manipulation is the name of the game. And no one's doing anything here to hurt anyone, and yet those words do have power.
So have you read her book?
No.
Because something that she's been saying is like, oh, people haven't read my book, but they're still out here protesting. So what would be your argument in response to that?
Well, as an academic who engages in gender and sexuality studies, I'm very widely read on these topics, and I think that Professor Stock's book isn't exactly of the highest calibre. I would put my attention more in the works of authors like Judith Butler and other trans and non-binary professors who have been writing about this topic for a lot longer than she has.
I think many NHS questionnaires now ask you your gender rather than your sex.
They ask what gender you were assigned at birth.
Yes.
When clearly you were born either male or female.
And
then males in female sports.
Yes.
Which is, that's why there is female category in sport.
Yes.
Because it's a completely unfair advantage, and why testosterone is an illegal drug.
Yes, and men and women's prisons, men and women's refuges, rape centres, hospitals, toilets.
And children being affirmed, so
Yes.
they're then taking
Yes.
puberty-blocking drugs, which effectively sterilises them.
The classic argument is freedom of speech.
Oh yeah. So we should allow, like, I don't know, Alex Jones to come and talk, and we allow like racists and stuff and come and talk rhetoric that it's freedom of speech, and then there are like bedrock things that we don't accept as society.
This isn't really about freedom of speech. This is about debating somebody's existence, debating somebody's right to go to the toilet. If we were to debate black people's existence, if we were to debate Jewish people's existence, there would be outrage, but it's perfectly acceptable to debate trans existence.
Many academics have said they're terrified to speak out. J.K. Rowling's been able to carry on because she doesn't, she's her own master and she's not employed by anybody.
But has been subjected to huge
She
amounts
has
of abuse.
many death threats.
I think it's very clear that the framing of trans people's existence in society around women's rights and women's safety is a confected moral panic. There is very, very little evidence to suggest that trans and non-binary people represent any danger to women whatsoever. And certainly, as such a small minority, it's very unlikely that they would have a significant effect on women's safety or rights in society. So I don't see this clash of rights as being a legitimate concern. I think it's been constructed by the media often, it's been constructed by right-wing politicians, and I don't really buy the argument that this is about women's rights or safety being threatened.
The statistics, the evidence show that there is a very small, minute minority of violence by trans women to women. It's a minute percentage, but on the basis of that, they've blown it out of all proportion, and it's verging on hysteria, moral panic. I don't know what you'd call it. That's not to belittle women who have suffered violence from men, but most trans women I know are very sensitive, very caring, very loving, and probably more feminist than Kathleen Stock.
There shouldn't be this tension between trans rights and non-trans women's rights. I think that a lot of that is being stirred up to drive division and to divide hate. Most of the time, I transitioned 10 years ago, and you know, I've always felt comfortable using the bathroom and I've never been challenged, whereas I do know some women who aren't transgender who have been challenged by people. And so if we start talking about who can use the bathrooms, then that becomes a very, very slippery slope.
Women's sport is at threat of being completely destroyed if we allow lots of biological males. You've only got to look at Leah Thomas in the women's swimming in the USA, Emily Bridges in cycling. As soon as biological males are allowed in, they just beat all the women, and that's deeply unfair.
I don't see like why we should be banning trans people from sport. Like, what are the dangers? Like these dangers are like they're suggested all the time, but
they're kind of phantom. Yeah.
They're never really like defined. We're just told to be scared of it. Like,
and the thing is that sport is part of life, right? It's part of our culture. So sport isn't some kind of separate place where you don't have real life questions and concerns. So if trans people are part of society, they've got to be able to play sports. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings as well around the supposed advantage that trans women have. It's never a headline when a trans woman doesn't win a race. Or there was a famous example recently where a trans woman ran a marathon and she came like 7,000th out of 15,000 people, and the headlines in the paper were that she'd beat 8,000 women. It's like she also got beaten by a bunch of women as well, by a bunch of cis women, and maybe some other trans women that we don't know about. So I think it's totally warped and kind of distorted.
I mean, the first trans Olympian to take part in the Olympics was a trans man.
Right.
So what does that tell you about the supposed biological advantages?
We have historically been the scapegoat for society. We're a scapegoat for right-wing politics. The Tories have chosen to make us an election issue because it polarises society, and they're playing on fear, they're playing on ignorance, they're playing on hysteria, and the media all plays into that, all feeds into that.
Nobody's really scared of trans men. Trans men are women in men's spaces, so they're not a threat. But of course, trans women are men in women's spaces, and they are a threat because 2.5 women are still being killed a week in the UK by men. So it's the size and violence aspect.
And rapists being able to get into women's prisons, biological males in women's sport.